On the evening of November 7, 1942, Oberst Wilhelm Schaefer of the German Armistice Commission in Casablanca stood on the roof of the Hotel Excelsior and watched the American fleet materialize from the Atlantic darkness. He counted the ships through his binoculars until counting became pointless. There were too many. Transports, destroyers, cruisers, an invasion fleet stretching to the horizon, backlit by a moon that seemed complicit in the assault. Somewhere in that armada were the first American ground troops that German forces would face in the war. Schaefer lowered his binoculars and lit a cigarette with steady hands. "So," he remarked to the Vichy French colonel beside him, "the Americans have finally decided to fight." He had read the intelligence assessments. The American Army was an improvised force, hastily expanded from a peacetime corps of 190,000 men to something approaching millions. But millions of what? Clerks, factory workers, farm boys who had never heard a shot fired in anger. Their officers were reserve captains and weekend warriors, promoted beyond all competence to fill an organization chart. Their doctrine was untested, their equipment was unproven, their soldiers were soft, raised on baseball and Hollywood, utterly unprepared for the reality of combat against the Wehrmacht. "They will learn," Schaefer said, exhaling smoke into the salt air. "The British learned at Dunkirk. The French learned in 6 weeks. The Russians are learning now, in their millions. The Americans will learn too, and the tuition will be paid in blood." The colonel nodded. Everyone knew the Americans would have to be blooded before they became dangerous. If they ever became dangerous at all. The smart money in Berlin said they never would. The Americans were a commercial people, not a martial one. They would negotiate after their first real defeat. Among the ships Schaefer watched that night was the USS Leonard Wood, carrying elements of a newly formed unit designated the 3rd Infantry Division. The division had existed on paper since 1917, but had been reconstituted only months earlier from a cadre of professional soldiers and an influx of draftees from across the American heartland. They called themselves the Rock of the Marne, after a battle most of them had only read about. Schaefer would have laughed at the grandiose nickname. A rock? These Americans? They would shatter at the first impact, like all the others. What Oberst Wilhelm Schaefer didn't know, what no German officer in November 1942 could possibly have conceived, was that he was watching the arrival of the most relentlessly effective infantry division the United States would field in the European theater, a division that would fight from North Africa to Sicily to Italy to France to Germany itself across 531 consecutive days of combat and compile a record so lopsided it would seem like clerical error. 90,000 German prisoners captured. 1 American soldier taken prisoner. 1. The 3rd Infantry Division had not come to North Africa to learn. They had come to teach. German confidence in late 1942 was not arrogance. It was arithmetic. The Wehrmacht had spent 3 years compiling data on what happened when untested armies met German infantry in combat. The results were consistent to the point of monotony. Poland had lasted 5 weeks. France, the finest army in Europe, veterans of Verdun, holders of the world's most fortified border, had collapsed in 6. Yugoslavia fell in 11 days, Greece in 24. The British Expeditionary Force had been hurled into the sea at Dunkirk, abandoning equipment sufficient to outfit 10 divisions. And these were professional armies, armies with decades of institutional knowledge, veteran officer corps, and soldiers who had grown up expecting to fight. What, then, could be expected from an American force that had possessed only 190,000 soldiers 2 years earlier, that had not fought a major war since 1918? That had spent the intervening decades disbanding divisions and melting down tanks. General Major Friedrich von Breusch, commanding the German advisory mission to Tunisia, summarized the prevailing assessment in a December 1942 memorandum to Berlin. The American soldier is well equipped and adequately fed, but these advantages are superficial. He lacks the fundamental qualities that warfare demands: discipline forged through hardship, leadership tempered by combat, and the spiritual preparation for death that distinguishes a warrior from a civilian in uniform. The American army is a mobilization army, large, expensive, and brittle. It will not survive its first serious test. Von Breuck was not a fool. He was a decorated veteran of the Eastern Front who had seen what determined infantry could accomplish and what happened when determination failed. His assessment reflected genuine analysis, not prejudice. The mathematics supported him. German doctrine held that the first 6 months of combat determined an army's character. During this crucible, a force either developed the institutional reflexes necessary for survival, what the Germans called Kampferfahrung, battle experience, or it broke apart under pressure and never recovered. The process could not be accelerated. It could not be taught in training camps. It could only be learned through blood, and the tuition was always catastrophic. The British had paid that tuition at Dunkirk, in Greece, in Crete, in the Western Desert, and even after 2 years of continuous warfare, they remained inconsistent, capable of brilliant defensive stands and embarrassing collapses in equal measure. The Soviets were paying it now, trading millions of casualties for the experience necessary to eventually fight back. Why should the Americans be any different? History suggested they would be worse. The American Expeditionary Force of 1917 to 1918 had arrived in France with enthusiasm and numbers, but had required nearly a year of French and British tutelage before conducting independent operations. Even then, their performance had been uneven, brave, but tactically clumsy, prone to frontal assaults that more experienced armies had learned to avoid. General Erich Ludendorff had noted in his memoirs that American soldiers died well, but fought poorly. 24 years later, the new American Army appeared to be repeating every mistake. Intelligence reports reaching Berlin described a force obsessed with logistics and comfort, whose officers spent more time on supply tables than tactical problems. American training emphasized firepower over maneuver, material over will, the hallmarks of a nation that believed wars could be won by spending money rather than blood. Oberst Hermann Balck, one of the Wehrmacht's finest tactical commanders, offered a blunter assessment during a staff conference in November 1942. The Americans believe that artillery and aircraft can substitute for infantry skill. They are about to discover that shells cannot hold ground. Only men can hold ground, and their men are not ready. The German calculation was simple. The Americans would attack, suffer heavily, lose confidence, and either negotiate or require years to develop the competence necessary to threaten the Reich. Time favored Germany. Every month the Americans spent learning to fight was a month the Wehrmacht could use to consolidate its conquests and fortify its positions. The calculation was logical. The calculation was wrong. What German intelligence could not measure, what no assessment could capture, was that somewhere in the invasion fleet approaching North Africa was a division that would refuse to follow the script. The 3rd Infantry Division was reborn in the California desert in the summer of 1942, and its father was a man who believed that most American soldiers were training to lose. Major General Jonathan W. Anderson took command of the division at Fort Lewis, Washington in January 1942, 6 weeks after Pearl Harbor, and found what he expected to find: a formation that existed on paper but barely existed in reality. The 3rd had been a skeleton since 1921, its regiments scattered across posts from California to Georgia, its ranks filled with career soldiers who had grown comfortable in peacetime routine. Anderson had 90 days to transform this administrative fiction into a combat division capable of invading a hostile shore. He was not optimistic. "The American Army has forgotten how to fight," Anderson wrote in his diary on February 3, 1942. "We remember how to march, how to salute, how to maintain equipment. We have forgotten that the purpose of all this is to close with the enemy and kill him. Our training manuals discuss suppressing the enemy and neutralizing positions. These are the words of men who have never seen battle. You do not suppress an enemy. You destroy him. You do not neutralize a position. You take it and kill everyone inside. Until our soldiers understand this, they are not soldiers. They are civilians with rifles." Anderson's solution was brutality. He drove his men through forced marches of 30 miles carrying full combat loads. He conducted live fire exercises with ammunition passing close enough to kill anyone who raised his head at the wrong moment, and occasionally did kill, accepting the casualties as necessary tuition. He dismissed officers who showed hesitation and promoted sergeants who showed aggression. He created an environment where the training was so harsh that combat would feel like relief. But Anderson understood that harshness alone would not create excellence. He also instituted a philosophy that would define the 3rd Division throughout the war: decentralized initiative combined with relentless forward momentum. "The enemy will try to stop you with fire," Anderson told his officers during a training exercise in March 1942. "He will try to stop you with obstacles. He will try to stop you with fear. None of these will work if you never stop moving. A stationary soldier is a dead soldier. A unit that pauses to reorganize is a unit that will be destroyed while reorganizing. You move forward until you reach your objective, or you die moving forward. Those are the only acceptable outcomes." The doctrine was heretical by American standards. Conventional training emphasized fire and maneuver, advance under covering fire, suppress the enemy, move to a position of advantage. Anderson considered this a recipe for paralysis. In his vision, the fire and the maneuver were the same thing. You advanced into the enemy's fire while delivering your own. You accepted casualties in motion rather than waiting to accumulate them in place. When Anderson was promoted to Corps Command in August 1942, his successor refined the doctrine further. Major General Lucian K. Truscott, Jr. was a cavalryman by training and temperament, aggressive, profane, and utterly contemptuous of any plan that did not involve attacking. He had observed British commando operations and served as a liaison with Lord Mountbatten's Combined Operations Headquarters. He understood amphibious warfare in a way few American officers did, and he understood speed. Truscott instituted what became known as the Truscott Trot, a movement pace of 4 miles per hour, sustained for hours, that shattered conventional infantry doctrine. Standard U.S. Army pace was 2.5 miles per hour. British infantry moved at 3. Truscott demanded 4, and he got it through conditioning so punishing that men collapsed on marches and were left where they fell. "Speed is armor," Truscott told his regimental commanders. "Speed is firepower. Speed is surprise. The enemy cannot hit what he cannot fix in place. If we move faster than his decision cycle, we will be past his defensive positions before he can react to our presence. We will not fight his battle. We will fight our battle on our terms, at our pace." The men hated him for it. They called him Old Man Gravel Voice for the throat injury that gave his commands a rasping intensity. They cursed his name on 20-mile speed marches through the Mojave. They fell out by the hundreds during training exercises designed to identify who could keep up and who could not. But those who remained became something different. The 3rd Infantry Division that boarded transports for Operation Torch in October 1942 was not the shambling garrison force that had existed 9 months earlier. It was 15,000 men conditioned to move faster than any infantry in the world, trained to attack through fire rather than around it, led by officers who had been selected for aggression and stripped of anyone who hesitated. They were not what German intelligence expected. They were not what anyone expected. They were a division built specifically to violate every assumption the Wehrmacht held about American soldiers, and they were about to prove it. The invasion of North Africa nearly killed the 3rd Division before it could fire a shot. On November 8, 1942, the landing craft carrying the division's 7th Infantry Regiment toward the beaches near Fadala, Morocco, ran into a nightmare of confusion. Navigation errors scattered the assault waves across 12 miles of coastline. Landing craft broached in the heavy surf and spilled men into water over their heads. Equipment sank. Radios failed. Companies landed in the wrong sectors. Platoons became separated from their officers, and soldiers who had trained for months to attack in coordinated waves found themselves alone on unfamiliar beaches in the dark. Vichy French defenders, not Germans, but French colonial troops loyal to the collaborationist government, opened fire from shore positions. Mortars walked across the sand. Machine guns raked the waterline. The men of the 3rd Division died in the surf, in the sand, tangled in their own equipment, before most of them had fired their weapons. By dawn, 137 soldiers were dead or missing. Hundreds more were scattered across miles of beach with no unit cohesion and no communication with higher headquarters. The careful plans developed over months had dissolved in the first 3 hours. It was exactly what German observers had predicted. Oberst Schaefer, monitoring the invasion from Casablanca, transmitted an assessment to Berlin on November 9th. American landing operations confirm pre-war analysis. Their troops demonstrate poor discipline under fire, inadequate seamanship, and a reliance on material superiority that cannot compensate for tactical incompetence. Vichy forces with minimal training and obsolete equipment have inflicted disproportionate casualties. If this is the quality of American arms, the Reich has little to fear. The assessment was not entirely unfair. The Fadala landings had been a fiasco by any professional standard. The 3rd Division's after-action report cataloged failures in waterproofing, communication, navigation, and small unit leadership. General Truscott himself acknowledged that the operation succeeded despite our mistakes, not because of our competence. But Schaefer's report missed something critical. The 3rd Division did not stop. Despite the chaos on the beaches, despite the casualties and the confusion, the surviving elements of the 7th Infantry Regiment reorganized under fire and attacked inland. They did not wait for reinforcement. They did not pause to establish a secure perimeter. They moved at the Truscott trot 4 miles per hour toward objectives that many of them could no longer identify on their ruined maps. By nightfall on November 8th, elements of the 3rd Division had advanced 11 miles inland. By November 10th, they had surrounded Casablanca. By November 11th, the Vichy French garrison surrendered. The victory was overshadowed by what came next. In February 1943, the U.S. Second Corps, including elements of the 1st Armored Division and the 34th Infantry Division, met the Wehrmacht for the first time at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. The result was catastrophic. German armor under General Major Friedrich von Broich punched through American lines with contemptuous ease. Units broke and ran. Officers abandoned their commands. In 4 days, the Americans suffered over 6,000 casualties, lost 183 tanks, and retreated 50 miles. Kasserine Pass confirmed every German assumption about American fighting quality. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding the Afrika Korps, assessed the battle with brutal concision. The American soldier does not yet know how to fight. He has equipment, but no instinct. He fires at shadows and runs from contact. This is not an army. This is a mob with rifles. The 3rd Infantry Division had not been present at Kasserine. They were still in Morocco conducting training operations. But the defeat stained every American unit in the theater. German prisoners taken in subsequent weeks openly mocked their captors. One lieutenant from the 21st Panzer Division, interrogated after a skirmish near Gafsa, laughed when asked about American combat capability. "You send us your businessmen and your farmers and call them soldiers. We send you our soldiers and you call them prisoners. This is the exchange rate of this war. It will not change." Within the American command, doubts festered. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, commanding Allied forces in North Africa, privately questioned whether American divisions could ever match German infantry in close combat. British officers, already skeptical of their transatlantic allies, whispered that the Americans would need years of seasoning before they could be trusted with independent operations. The shadow of Kasserine hung over every planning session, every staff meeting, every discussion of future operations. The 3rd Division felt the doubt. They had not failed at Kasserine, but they wore the same uniform as those who had. When they finally moved forward into Tunisia in March 1943, they moved under a cloud of suspicion. An American division that had yet to prove it was any different from the formations that had broken and run. The Germans awaited them with confidence. The arithmetic still favored the Wehrmacht. One German veteran was worth 3 Americans, perhaps more. The Afrika Korps had been winning battles in the desert for 2 years. The 3rd Infantry Division had been winning nothing but training exercises. The odds were clear. The outcome was not. March 20th, 1943. The village of El Gueter, Tunisia, a place no American had heard of and no German would ever forget. Staff Sergeant Henry Bodner of the 3rd Division's 30th Infantry Regiment crouched in a slit trench and watched the German counterattack develop across the valley floor. The 10th Panzer Division, veterans of Poland, France, and 2 years of desert warfare, was coming straight at them. Bodner counted the tanks through his binoculars until he ran out of numbers he could hold in his head. 40, 50, more behind them, half obscured by dust, and between the tanks, infantry, hundreds of them, advancing in the loose formations that German doctrine prescribed. The men around Bodner had never seen a German tank assault. Most had never been shot at by anything more dangerous than Vichy French conscripts. They were farmers and factory workers from Wisconsin and Illinois, drafted 18 months ago, trained in the California desert, and now dug into rocky Tunisian soil with nothing between them and the Panzers except their rifles and a few 37mm anti-tank guns that everyone knew couldn't penetrate German armor. "Hold fire until I give the word," Captain Marcus Dillon said, moving down the trench line. His voice was calm. "Let them get close." The Germans expected the Americans to break. Every engagement since Kasserine had followed the same pattern. The Panzers would advance, the American line would waver, fire would slacken, and then the retreat would begin. Not a rout. The Americans rarely routed entirely, but a steady, demoralizing withdrawal that surrendered ground and prisoners and equipment in predictable quantities. The 10th Panzer had captured over 1,500 Americans in the past month. Their commander, General Lieutenant Fritz von Broich, had joked at a staff meeting that his division was becoming a prisoner processing unit. He was about to discover that the processing had ended. At 800 yards, Captain Dillon gave the order. The 30th Infantry's line erupted. The first volley was not rifle fire. It was artillery, massed batteries of 105mm howitzers that Truscott had positioned on the reverse slopes, pre-registered on the valley floor. The shells arrived without warning, bracketing the advancing panzers, turning the neat German formations into chaos. Tanks slewed sideways, trying to escape the barrage. Infantry scattered for cover that didn't exist. And then the 3rd Division attacked, not defended, not held, attacked. Bodner was on his feet before he fully understood what was happening. The men around him were moving forward into the German assault, firing as they ran. It violated everything he'd been taught about defending against armor. You did not charge tanks. You found cover and prayed and let the tanks pass, and hoped the infantry behind them didn't find your position. But they were charging. The entire 30th Infantry was charging. The Germans had never seen this. American infantry did not advance into panzer attacks. American infantry retreated from panzer attacks. That was the established order, the arithmetic of the Desert War. But the men of the 3rd Division had not learned that arithmetic. They had learned Truscott's arithmetic, which held that a moving target was harder to hit than a stationary one. That speed was armor, that the only acceptable outcomes were the objective or death. Bodner found himself among the German infantry before he fully processed the distance he'd covered. A Wehrmacht soldier, young, blonde, terrified, raised his rifle. Bodner shot him in the chest and kept moving. Another German emerged from behind a burning half-track. Bodner shot him too. The world had compressed to a tunnel of noise and dust and targets, and his body was doing things his mind couldn't keep pace with. The Panzers, deprived of their infantry screen, suddenly found themselves surrounded by American soldiers who didn't seem to understand they were supposed to be afraid of tanks. Men were climbing onto engine decks and firing through vision slits. Grenades were dropping into open hatches. A sergeant from Bodner's platoon, a former coal miner from Pennsylvania named Kowalski, shoved a rifle barrel into a tank's air intake and fired until the engine seized. The attack lasted 47 minutes. When it was over, the 10th Panzer Division had lost 32 tanks and over 600 men. The 3rd Infantry Division had lost 47 killed and 198 wounded, and had captured 537 German prisoners. General Lieutenant von Broich received the casualty reports that evening in his headquarters at Gabes. He read them twice, certain there had been a transcription error. His staff assured him there had not. "They attacked into us?" he asked. "Yes, Herr General. They advanced directly into the panzer assault." "On foot? Infantry?" "Yes, Herr General." Von Broich set down the report. In 30 years of military service, he had never seen infantry charge armor successfully. The tactic was suicidal. It should not have worked. It had worked. "Who are these Americans?" he asked. No one had an answer. The question would echo across German headquarters throughout Tunisia in the weeks that followed. The 3rd Infantry Division did not stop at El Ghoutar. They advanced 30 miles in the next 4 days, shattering defensive positions that should have held for weeks. They moved at speeds German intelligence insisted were impossible for infantry, 4 miles per hour, sustained for hours, arriving at objectives before defenders could prepare. On April 7, 1943, the 7th Infantry Regiment overran a German artillery position near Bizerte and captured an intact battery of 88mm guns, the most feared weapons in the German arsenal. The gun crews surrendered without firing because the Americans had arrived 3 hours ahead of the earliest possible estimate. They had not had time to destroy their equipment. The battery commander, Hauptmann Ernst Müller, was still protesting when he was led to the rear. "This is not possible. We calculated your approach speed. You cannot be here yet." Private First Class Raymond Torres, escorting the prisoners, shrugged. "Nobody told us that." Word spread through the Afrika Korps with the speed of rumor and the weight of dread. There was an American division that did not fight like Americans. They attacked when they should have defended. They advanced when they should have retreated. They moved faster than the calculations allowed. The soldiers of the 3rd Division had a different way of describing themselves. "We don't know how to lose," Sergeant Bodner wrote to his wife after El Ghoutar. "I don't mean that like bragging. I mean the generals never taught us. They only taught us how to attack. So that's what we do. We attack. Every time. All the time. I think the Germans are starting to figure that out." They were. And they did not like what they were learning. Sicily broke the last illusions. On July 10, 1943, the 3rd Infantry Division stormed ashore at Licata as part of Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. They hit the beach at 02:35 hours, in darkness, against Italian coastal divisions that German advisors had assured would hold for at least 48 hours. The beach was secure by dawn. The town of Licata fell by noon. By nightfall, the 3rd Division had advanced 18 miles inland, a rate of movement that caused Allied headquarters to request confirmation, certain the reports were exaggerated. They were not exaggerated. General Truscott had unleashed his division like a compressed spring. The Truscott Trot carried them across the Sicilian interior at speeds that outpaced their own supply lines. They moved so fast that retreating Italian units found Americans blocking roads they had planned to use for withdrawal. They moved so fast that German reinforcements arriving to stabilize the front discovered the front had already passed them. On July 17th, elements of the 15th Infantry Regiment entered the town of Agrigento, 37 miles from the landing beaches, and found a German staff car still idling outside a cafe. The driver was inside, finishing his coffee. He had not heard that the Americans were within 50 miles. Oberstleutnant Victor Hübner of the Hermann Göring Division recorded the chaos in his war diary. The American 3rd Division does not advance according to any doctrine we recognize. They do not pause to consolidate. They do not wait for flank security. They simply advance, continuously, regardless of the tactical situation. Our defensive plans assume a certain tempo of enemy movement. These Americans move at a tempo we did not believe infantry could sustain. By the time we identify their position, they have already left it. The Hermann Göring Division, an elite Luftwaffe formation considered among the finest units in the German order of battle, attempted to counterattack the 3rd Division near Butera on July 11th. The attack was shattered in 2 hours. The Germans lost 400 men and a dozen tanks. The 3rd Division's 7th Infantry Regiment lost 23 killed and advanced through the wreckage without stopping to count the dead. Sicily fell in 38 days. The 3rd Division had crossed the entire island, west to east, and was preparing to assault Messina when the campaign ended. They had captured over 10,000 prisoners. They had lost one man as a prisoner themselves, a wounded private from the 30th Infantry who was overrun during a German counterattack and recovered 3 days later when his captors surrendered. The ratio was establishing itself. 10,000 to 1. German intelligence began tracking the 3rd Division specifically. Reports circulated through Wehrmacht headquarters identifying the unit's distinctive blue and white shoulder patch, 3 diagonal stripes, as a warning sign. Where the patch appeared, German commanders learned to expect attacks that came faster and hit harder than the arithmetic allowed. Italy taught them the lesson again and again and again. The 3rd Division landed at Anzio on January 22, 1944, as part of an Allied end run around the Gustav Line. What was supposed to be a quick thrust to Rome became a 4-month siege as German forces counterattacked with everything they had. 6 German divisions, including elements of the elite 1st Parachute Division and the 26th Panzer Division, attempted to drive the Allies back into the sea. The 3rd Division held the most exposed sector of the beachhead. For 126 consecutive days, they fought without relief. German artillery pounded their positions around the clock. Counterattacks came in waves. Company strength, battalion strength, sometimes division strength. The Wehrmacht threw its finest formations against the blue and white patch, certain that eventually the Americans would break the way Americans always broke. They did not break. On February 29, 1944, during the largest German assault of the campaign, the 3rd Division's positions absorbed attacks from 3 German divisions simultaneously. The fighting lasted 16 hours. When it was over, the Germans had gained no ground. They had lost 2,500 men. The 3rd Division had lost 388 and had captured 609 prisoners. General Lieutenant Fritz Hubert Grazer, commanding the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, wrote to his wife after the failed assault, "I have fought the British in Africa. I have fought the Russians at Kursk. I have never encountered infantry like this American division. They do not yield ground. They do not accept local defeats. When we break through in one sector, they counterattack in another. When we kill their officers, their sergeants lead. When we kill their sergeants, their privates lead. There is no breaking them. There is only killing them, one by one, and they make us pay for every body." The letter was captured when Grazer's headquarters was overrun in May 1944. It circulated through Allied intelligence as evidence of collapsing German morale. But it was the smaller details that revealed the true psychological impact. German prisoners taken at Anzio were interrogated about their units, their commanders, their morale. Standard questions. But the interrogators noticed something unusual in prisoners captured from sectors facing the 3rd Division. They did not boast. German prisoners from other sectors often maintained defiance, insisting the Wehrmacht would ultimately prevail. Prisoners taken from the 3rd Division's front spoke differently. "We knew it was the 3rd Division," said Feldwebel Johann Kessler of the 715th Infantry Division, captured on March 4, 1944. "Everyone knew. They marked their vehicles with 3 stripes. When we saw the stripes, we knew the attack would not stop. Other American divisions would hit us and then pause, reorganize, wait for support. Not the 3rd Division. They hit us and kept hitting. You could not catch your breath. You could not count your casualties. You could only try to survive until they moved on to the next position. And then it was someone else's turn to die." The interrogator noted that Kessler's hands shook throughout the interview. Breakout came in May 1944. The 3rd Division spearheaded the assault from the Anzio beachhead, smashing through German defensive lines that had held for 4 months. They covered 23 miles in the first 2 days. On June 4, 1944, 2 days before D-Day in Normandy, they entered Rome. No pause. No celebration. They swept through the city and kept moving north. The 3rd Division's commanding general by then was Major General John W. Iron Mike O'Daniel, who had replaced Truscott when Truscott was elevated to Corps Command. O'Daniel was, if anything, more aggressive than his predecessor. He issued a single standing order that governed all operations. When in doubt, attack. The division never seemed to be in doubt. Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France, put them ashore again on August 15, 1944. Within 3 weeks, they had advanced 500 miles, liberating towns whose residents had not heard the Allies were within 100 miles. They moved so quickly that the division's own headquarters lost track of forward elements for days at a time. German units attempting to retreat northward through the Rhone Valley found the 3rd Division already blocking the roads. Rearguards became prisoners, convoys became wreckage, and organized withdrawal became a rout. On August 28, 1944, the 15th Infantry Regiment captured the town of Montélimar, and with it, the remnants of the German 338th Infantry Division. Over 5,800 prisoners in a single action. The division commander, General Major Robert Bader, surrendered his sidearm to a 23-year-old lieutenant from Ohio, who had been in the army for 14 months. "You moved too fast," Bader said through an interpreter, his voice flat with exhaustion. "We could not establish defensive positions. We could not coordinate withdrawal. You were always already there. Always." The lieutenant had no response. He had not been trained to talk to German generals. He had been trained to capture them. The Reich was collapsing, one prisoner at a time, and the 3rd Division was just getting started. The final accounting required columns of figures that seemed more appropriate to industrial production than military operations. 531 days of continuous combat, 4 amphibious assaults, North Africa, Sicily, Anzio, southern France, 7 countries crossed, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Sicily, Italy, France, Germany. Over 15,000 miles traveled under fire. And the prisoners. The 3rd Infantry Division captured 90,811 enemy soldiers between November 1942 and May 1945. The number is precise because the Army recorded every prisoner processed, each one a signature, a form, a deduction from the Wehrmacht's dwindling strength. 90,000 men who had expected to fight and instead found themselves marching to the rear with their hands raised. The ratio was 90,811 to 1. That single American prisoner, Private First Class Leonard Benson of the 30th Infantry Regiment, captured at Anzio on February 18, 1944, during a German night infiltration, was recovered 8 days later when the 3rd Division overran his captor's position. He had not been processed through the German prisoner system. He had not been transported to a stalag. He had simply waited with the patience of a man who understood that his division would come for him. They always came. The statistics of destruction complemented the statistics of capture. The 3rd Division was credited with killing or wounding an estimated 47,000 German and Italian soldiers, a number that carried asterisks and uncertainties, because the chaos of combat did not permit precise body counts. They destroyed 420 tanks, 687 artillery pieces, and over 2,000 vehicles. They liberated 1,051 towns and villages. They advanced in total further than any other American division in the European theater. But statistics are abstractions. The testimony of the men who faced them carried different weight. After the war, Allied intelligence services conducted extensive interviews with captured German officers, seeking to understand what had worked and what had failed. The interrogation files, declassified in stages over the following decades, contained repeated references to the 3rd Infantry Division. General Lieutenant Fritz Hubert Graeser, whose letter to his wife had described the 3rd Division as unlike any infantry he had encountered, was interviewed at length in June 1945. The transcript ran to 47 pages. On page 31, the interrogator asked which American unit he considered most effective. Graeser did not hesitate. The 3rd Infantry Division. Without question, we faced many American formations, and most of them fought competently after their initial mistakes. But the 3rd Division was different in quality, not merely in degree. They attacked with a speed and ferocity that suggested they did not understand they could be defeated. Perhaps they could not be. Certainly, we could not defeat them. Every engagement cost us more than we could afford. Every defensive position they approached, they took. I told my staff that fighting the 3rd Division was like fighting fire. You could not negotiate with it, could not reason with it, could only retreat from it or be consumed. The interrogator asked about German attempts to capture soldiers from the division. Graeser shook his head. "We took prisoners from other American divisions regularly. Patrols, stragglers, men cut off from their units. This is normal in war. From the 3rd Division, almost never. Their men did not surrender. They did not straggle. When cut off, they attacked to rejoin their lines. We joked that the 3rd Division did not contain soldiers. It contained ammunition that had not yet been fired." Similar assessments emerged across the interrogation files. Oberst Wilhelm Meyer, who had commanded a regiment of the 198th Infantry Division in the Vosges Mountains, was captured in November 1944 after his unit was encircled by the 3rd Division's 15th Infantry Regiment. His interrogation contained a passage that circulated widely among American intelligence officers. "My regiment was considered experienced. We had fought in Russia for 2 years. We understood defensive warfare. When we learned that the American 3rd Division was approaching our sector, I requested reinforcement. My divisional commander asked why I was concerned about a single American division. I told him, "This is not a normal division. This is a division that does not stop." He thought I was exaggerating. 3 days later, my regiment no longer existed. Not destroyed, absorbed, captured. My men surrendered in groups of 50 and 100 because there was no point in dying for positions the Americans would take regardless. I was the last to surrender, and I surrendered because I was alone. Everyone else was already in American hands. Meyer paused during this portion of the interrogation. "You want to know the truth about the 3rd Division?" he continued. "The truth is that we stopped thinking of them as Americans. Americans were the soldiers we had beaten at Kasserine. Americans were the troops who advanced cautiously and retreated when pressed. The 3rd Division was something else. We called them Die Schnellen, the fast ones. When we heard they were in our sector, morale dropped immediately. Not because our soldiers were cowards, because our soldiers were realists. They knew what was coming. They had heard the stories. Everyone had heard the stories. The stories had indeed spread. German veterans' accounts from the post-war period contained recurring motifs when discussing the 3rd Division: the impossible speed of their advances, the refusal to accept defensive positions, the relentless pressure that allowed no rest and no recovery. These were not the complaints of defeated men seeking excuses. They were the observations of professional soldiers trying to understand how they had been so thoroughly outmatched. Feldwebel Hermann Balck, no relation to the famous general of the same name, had served with the 11th Panzer Division and faced the 3rd Infantry Division during the fighting in Alsace. He wrote a memoir in 1962 that devoted an entire chapter to the American unit. We were taught that American soldiers were soft, that they relied on material and lacked fighting spirit, that they would break under pressure. These teachings were lies, not deliberate lies. The officers who taught us believed what they were saying. They were simply wrong. The 3rd Infantry Division had fighting spirit that matched any unit I encountered in Russia. They had material superiority as well, yes, but that was not what made them dangerous. What made them dangerous was that they never gave us time to breathe. Other enemies paused. The Russians paused to bring up reserves. The British paused to coordinate with their artillery. The 3rd Division did not pause. They hit us and kept hitting until there was nothing left to hit. Balck's memoir described a specific incident from January 1945 when his company attempted to establish a defensive position outside the town of Colmar. We had dug in during the night. Good positions, well concealed. We expected an attack at dawn. That was the American pattern. Instead, the attack came at 0300 in complete darkness. They had moved through our forward outposts without triggering any alarm. By the time we understood what was happening, they were among us. I saw American soldiers moving through our trenches with bayonets, killing men who were still reaching for their weapons. It was over in minutes. My company lost 47 men killed and 82 captured. I escaped because I was checking the rear positions when the attack began. This was not warfare as I understood it. This was something from the ancient world, a raid by men who wanted to kill, not merely to win. The distinction mattered to Balck. Throughout his memoir, he returned to the idea that the 3rd Division fought with a different intent than other American units, that they sought not merely victory, but annihilation. Other American divisions wanted to take ground. The 3rd Division wanted to destroy us. Every engagement was conducted with maximum violence. Every position was attacked with more force than necessary. They did not preserve their strength. They spent it freely, knowing they would have more tomorrow, and they were right. They always had more. We never did. The captured documents told the same story from the opposite perspective. German divisional war diaries, meticulously maintained even as the Reich collapsed, contained references to the 3rd Infantry Division that tracked an arc from contempt through concern to despair. Early entries from Tunisia and Sicily described aggressive but inexperienced American troops. Later entries from Italy and France used different language. Extremely dangerous, to be avoided if possible, capable of penetrating any defensive position. A war diary entry from the 16th Volksgrenadier Division, dated March 15, 1945, 8 weeks before the German surrender, contained the final evolution. Contact with American 3rd Infantry Division in sector. Recommend immediate withdrawal. This unit cannot be held by forces currently available. Repeat, cannot be held. Request permission to fall back to secondary positions before encirclement is complete. Permission was denied. The division was encircled. 2,300 soldiers surrendered the following day. They joined the 90,000 who had come before them, the men who had laughed at American softness, who had predicted American collapse, who had calculated American weakness with the precision of accountants. They marched into captivity with their hands raised and their assumptions shattered. The 3rd Infantry Division had taught them a lesson that no classroom could provide, and the tuition had been paid entirely in German blood. On the evening of November 7th, 1942, Oberst Wilhelm Schaefer had stood on a rooftop in Casablanca and watched the American invasion fleet emerge from the darkness. He had permitted himself confidence. He had spoken of tuition paid in blood, of lessons the Americans would learn the way the British and French had learned them. They will learn, he had said, and the tuition will be paid in blood. He was half right. Schaefer survived the North African campaign, evacuated to Sicily ahead of the Allied advance, then to Italy, then to France, then finally to Germany itself, always one step ahead of the armies that pursued him. He ended the war in a prisoner-of-war camp in Bavaria, captured not by the 3rd Infantry Division, but by elements of the 42nd Infantry Division in the final weeks of the conflict. But he had heard of the 3rd Division. Everyone had. In a 1958 interview with a German military history journal, Schaefer was asked about his pre-war assessments of American fighting capability. The interview was conducted in the study of his home in Munich, surrounded by books on military theory that had failed to predict what actually happened. "We were correct about some things," Schaefer said. "The Americans were inexperienced. Their early operations were clumsy. They made mistakes that cost them lives. All of this we predicted accurately." He paused, adjusting his glasses. What we did not predict, what we could not predict, was how quickly they would learn. And there was one division that did not need to learn at all. They arrived already knowing how to destroy us. The 3rd Infantry Division. I watched them come ashore at Casablanca and thought they were lambs. They were wolves. They were wolves dressed as lambs, and we did not understand until they were at our throats. The interviewer asked if Schaefer had any explanation for the division's extraordinary record. Explanation? No. I have read their history. I have studied their commanders. I have spoken with officers who faced them. There is no explanation that satisfies. They were simply better than us, not better equipped. Everyone was better equipped than the Wehrmacht by 1944, better as soldiers, better as killers, better at the fundamental business of war, which is to destroy the enemy before he destroys you. Schaefer shook his head. 90,000 prisoners, 1 man lost. This is not a military record. This is a mathematical impossibility, and yet it happened. I saw the men who surrendered to them. I spoke with officers who had faced them. It happened. The interview concluded with a question about lessons for future military planners. Schaefer's answer was brief. Do not underestimate Americans. We thought they were soft because they were rich. We thought they were weak because they were comfortable. We were fools. Their comfort gave them confidence. Their wealth gave them resources. And somewhere in that vast, comfortable, wealthy nation, there were men who wanted to fight, who were born to fight, and when those men found each other, they became the 3rd Infantry Division. God help anyone who faces such men again. The 3rd Infantry Division earned 36 Medals of Honor during World War II, more than any other division in the United States Army. They earned the nickname the Rock of the Marne in the First War, and proved they deserved it in the Second. They created a legacy that would carry forward through Korea, through Vietnam, through Iraq and Afghanistan, through every conflict where American soldiers were asked to close with the enemy and destroy him. But the legacy that mattered most was simpler than medals or nicknames. 90,000 German soldiers had believed they would win. They had believed their doctrine, their experience, their warrior tradition would carry them through. They had looked at American soldiers and seen farmers and clerks, soft men from a soft nation, men who would break at the first pressure. They were wrong. 1 by 1, 10 by 10, 100 by 100, 1,000 by 1,000, they raised their hands and walked into captivity. They surrendered their weapons and their assumptions and their certainty. They learned the lesson that Oberst Schaefer had promised the Americans would learn. But they learned it themselves in a classroom made of mud and blood, and the relentless advance of men who simply refused to stop. The tuition, in the end, was paid, but not by the students Schaefer had expected. The 3rd Infantry Division did not come to Europe to learn how to fight. They came to teach the Wehrmacht how to lose.